Hello, and welcome back to the Sinobabble podcast. Today is another news roundup episode. I have 3.5 stories-ish. One of them is not really a story. Two of them are kind of related. It will make sense once we get into it. I'm going to endeavour to do this as quickly as possible because it is so hot today. It's like 30 degrees or something. I do have windows open, so apologies if there's a little bit of background noise, but otherwise I would just collapse. I apologise. Right, with that out of the way, let's get into it. So the first story is about the China deal with the Cook Islands and New Zealand's reaction to that. So you might have seen this headline already. This is from the BBC. New Zealand halts Cook Islands funding over China deals. Now, just really quickly, if you don't know what the Cook Islands are, they're islands in the Pacific. I would characterise them as near New Zealand just because they're not near anything else. They are not near to New Zealand at all. They're part of that group like the Solomon Islands as well. I think Tahiti and Fiji, those sorts of places. They have what's called free association with New Zealand, which means that Cook Islanders can hold New Zealand passports, but they are responsible for their own diplomatic and economic affairs. So they're like semi-self-governing, but they have free association with New Zealand. So let's read the story and try and understand a little bit about why New Zealand would care or be upset, what this deal means, and a little bit about the Cook Islands as well, and the sort of strategicness of them, which may or may not become apparent. New Zealand has paused millions of dollars in funding to the Cook Islands over wide-ranging deals that its smaller Pacific neighbour had made with China. Wellington, the Cook Islands' biggest funder, said it was blindsided by the deals that were struck in February, covering infrastructure, tourism, technology, and perhaps crucially, deep-sea mineral exploration. So just to quickly point out there, it says that the deal was signed in February, but the funding has only just been paused. They've only just made that decision. So this is actually kind of more of an update on the story. And then I'll go back in time a little bit as well to talk about what happened at the time in the Cook Islands and when the deal was signed. Fresh funding will not be considered until the Cook Islands takes concrete steps to repair the relationship and restore trust, said a spokesperson for New Zealand. The 18.2 million New Zealand dollars or 11 million US dollars or 8 million pounds funding halt comes as concerns grow among US allies, including New Zealand and Australia, over China's rise in the Pacific. Funding relies on a high trust bilateral relationship. New Zealand hopes that steps will be taken swiftly to address New Zealand's concerns so that this support can be resumed as soon as possible. The Cook Islands responded by saying that it was determined to address the issue as a matter of urgency, adding that it highly values New Zealand's development assistance. Constructive dialogue is ongoing, and the Cook Islands remain committed to engaging closely with New Zealand, blah blah blah. The deals with the Cook Islands are part of China's broader campaign to woo small but strategic Pacific nations. Beijing had earlier signed a security deal it signed with the Solomon Islands in 2022, which alarmed Western nations. Cook Islands Prime Minister Mark Brown said in February that its deals with China were based on its country's long-term interests and tried to reassure its neighbours, Australia and New Zealand, that they do not replace their long-standing relationship. China also said the deals were not meant to antagonise anyone in the region. The deal sparked protests on Rarotonga, the largest of the Cook Islands, and a vote of no confidence against Brown in Parliament, which he eventually survived. New Zealand has what's known as free association relationship with the Cook Islands, and it helps the latter with defence and foreign affairs. In the last 3 years, Wellington provided 194 million New Zealand dollars in funding to the Cook Islands. Cook Islanders also hold New Zealand passports. There are around 15,000 Cook Islanders living in their own nation, but as many as 100,000 live in New Zealand and Australia. These close ties explain why the Cooks' first-of-their-kind deals with China led to such strong reactions. Even before that, however, the Cook Islands had already shown signs of wanting to pull away. Late last year, it abandoned a proposal to introduce its own passport following public outcry. So that kind of details the antagonism or sort of the reaction from New Zealand. It doesn't really tell us what's involved in the deal with China. There is another story from The Guardian that is from February, so when the deal was actually signed, that talks a little bit more about the deal and also the protests that took place immediately following the announcement of this deal. So the title is The Cook Islands Releases Terms of Deal with China Amid Protests Around Lack of Transparency. A strategic partnership deal between China and the Cook Islands spans areas from deep sea mining to education scholarships, but excludes security ties, a document released by the Pacific Island nations government showed. So this is very different to the deal that it signed with the Solomon Islands, which is kind of a secretive security deal that didn't have that much detail. People think that it might allow China to set up a military base in the Solomon Islands, but China had already previously signed different deals with the Solomon Islands, which included development funding, and also asked the Solomon Islands no longer to recognize Taiwan, which they did agree to as part of that deal. So this could sort of be the first step with the Cook Islands, if that makes sense. But there is no indication as of yet that China seeks to set itself up strategically on the Cook Islands, like making a military base or a naval base or anything like that. Also, I don't know anything about military strategy, but these places just seem so far away. Like, I don't know, maybe they're strategic if you're doing like a very long journey, I don't know, to South America or something like that, or you've just got ships in the area. But I don't know, just looking at a map of where some of these places are, I don't always understand why these places are considered strategic. I think we're just supposed to take it for granted, maybe because they're near New Zealand, and if China wanted to invade or attack New Zealand or prevent or blockade an attack from New Zealand or Australia, those would be good places to be set up. It's not entirely clear. It's always just kind of stated and sort of moved on. I think that it's more strategic to these other nations, so to New Zealand, to Australia, to other countries in the Pacific, and they're worried more about their own strategic relationships being challenged as opposed to being explicit or even being able to explain exactly what China would gain from having closer relations with these nations. I'm sure someone knows. I'm not an expert in the geopolitics of the Pacific region, so if anybody does know and wants to give details, you're more than welcome to. It goes on to say that New Zealand had not been consulted in the discussion around the signing of the deal, and the Prime Minister, Mark Brown, said that this does not replace our long-standing relationships with New Zealand, Australia and others, but rather complements them, ensuring that we have a diversified portfolio of partnerships. However, it also states that opposition has grown in the Cook Islands to any threat its pact with China pose to close ties with New Zealand, and Brown's government faces a no-confidence vote in Parliament after the 25th of February called by opposition parties. Roughly 400 protesters, led by opposition parties, gathered outside the capital city, with some holding signs reading "Stay connected with New Zealand." So clearly some people feel that by being close with China, somehow this undermines their relationship with New Zealand. This also came at the same time that there was a proposal for the Cook Islands to have their own passport. So there is kind of this perception of like drawing away or moving away from New Zealand, which New Zealand has now confirmed by saying, well, we're not going to give you any funding. So I think some people were a bit more perceptive or saw this coming, or perhaps had dialogue with New Zealand at the time that suggested that this might be the case. So a bit more about the deal. The Prime Minister signed an action plan for the comprehensive strategic partnership with China. Brown said earlier the accord set a framework for engagement in areas including trade, investment, ocean science, infrastructure and transport. After returning home on Monday from China, Brown told reporters he would release full details of the agreement soon, and said China would provide the Pacific nation of 17,000 people with a one-time grant of around $4 million. Our ministries will be looking carefully at where they would like to allocate that funding as part of projects or initiatives that we might want to promote. At this stage, it's looking primarily in the area of renewable energies. Cook Islands officials say they also discussed seabed minerals research with Chinese institutes during the visit to China, as the Pacific island mulls deep-sea mining of nodules rich in metals such as nickel and cobalt, which, as we know from our other discussions around rare earth minerals, precious metals, metals that are used in renewable energies, or in the refining of things like batteries, and in the making of products like electronics, are very important minerals, metals. So that's a bit more about the deal, why New Zealand doesn't like it, why people in the Cook Islands might not like it, what kind of benefits it might have. But something that I didn't, again, going back to the strategic importance, I didn't really understand why the Cook Islands would need this development, because from my reading it didn't seem like the Cook Islands were a poor nation, and I was correct about this because I did find another article that basically said that the OECD had labelled the Cook Islands as a rich country. So I was like, okay, if they're a rich country, why do they need, first of all, this development aid from New Zealand in the first place? Why do they need this funding? Why do they need investment from China? What's going on here? So reading this article, it became more apparent that the Cook Islands' main source of income is essentially tourism. It's like 65% of their income comes from tourism. However, most of that tourism is from New Zealand and Australia. So if there were to be some sort of economic crisis in those countries that prevented tourists from coming, that would immediately have a knock-on effect on the Cook Islands economy, first of all. The second problem is that the population of the Cook Islands is dwindling because more and more young people are moving to New Zealand or Australia or wherever in order to find better economic opportunities. So they've got this dual issue, and at the same time they don't make enough money to really invest in sectors that could further their economy or help it grow outside of tourism. So things like agriculture and farming, this deep sea mining. So they need this continual infusion of funding aid from New Zealand because they're not really able to diversify or push their income above a certain rate. Basically, they're kind of like trapped in this like one specific place, relying on this one economy, not really able to put the funding into anything else. And I didn't read anything about New Zealand wanting to or not wanting to help them develop these other sectors of their economy, but it seems like it hasn't really been discussed. Or it might be one of those neo-colonial things where it's like, oh, we're being good enough to give you money to survive on, to boost your economy. We give you all these tourists and stuff, and that's sort of like the extent of our involvement, and you should be grateful for that. Whereas again, you have China coming in and being like, oh, you have these critical minerals, we can help you develop that industry, and potentially these Chinese companies that help them develop it will take a cut, or they will become the primary trade partner for the Cook Islands for these precious resources. And then on the other hand, the Cook Islands is able to become more self-sufficient. So just a line from this article quickly. The Cook Islands is reckoned to have up to a sixth of the world's reserves of cobalt, an element used in batteries and jet engines, but large-scale mining is still a long way off. Well before then, the OECD will have to make a decision. According to an OECD spokesperson, if a country meets the criteria for graduation, it cannot refuse graduation to this rich country status. So the Cook Islands has no choice but to be labelled rich, even though it's kind of trapped. It's, instead of being debt trapped, it's like aid trapped, essentially, and it can't really make any moves. So this deal with China is helping it make moves, helping it expand into these different areas of the economy that it's been looking to expand into for a very long time. So hopefully that gives a better overview of this story, and if it comes up again in the future, obviously we'll review it. But I thought that was just interesting to get this kind of overview. Like I said on Substack, I do have a written overview of the Solomon Islands deal, and everyone's uproar about that at the time in like 2022, so that was like 3 years ago. But yeah, it's interesting to see that China has added another one of these Pacific island countries to its roster, and what exactly will come out of that remains to be seen. Okay, the second story is about how Chinese brands are using advertising to expand into Europe. I wanted to talk about this story because I'm planning on doing a longer form episode fairly soon about how foreign brands got kicked out of China, and essentially how the next stage is for Chinese brands to expand globally. And we kind of discussed that a little bit already. We spoke about how some Chinese coffee brands are expanding mainly in Southeast Asia, in Singapore, Malaysia, places like that, brands like Luckin, and how Starbucks has already been basically losing a lot of ground in China and doesn't really know how to make that up. Now this article is talking about how brands that kind of tried and failed to expand in Europe before or globally before are now making a comeback and have sort of changed up their advertising in order to fit in with foreign models. So the article reads, slick advertising, sports sponsorships help boost Chinese brands' fortunes in Europe. Parisian Alexandre Martin still remembers Chinese electronics brand Xiaomi's old stores in the French capital where his parents and sister used to shop. They were at good locations like the Châtelet I used to go scout for stuff and then buy it online. The Chinese tech brand opened its first boutique in France in 2018, but had to close all stores in the country by 2022, opting instead to maintain a presence online. I don't think they were making a lot of money. Back then, its image was not that good, and there was always this sense that, it's Xiaomi, it's a Chinese brand, the quality is not good. Xiaomi is now preparing for a comeback, announcing plans this month to open 500 new retail stores outside China this year, especially in developed markets. It said it aims to open 10,000 stores overseas in the next 5 years. The decision to close all stores in France in 2022 corresponded to an adjustment in Xiaomi's retail strategy, which aimed to respond to the purchasing behaviour of the French. Xiaomi is now taking a different track. The advertisements in France now look very iPhone-ish, very simple, against a white background. The image of their products is a lot better this time. Analysts say Xiaomi was one of many Chinese brands that now stand a better chance of winning over European customers thanks to advertising efforts, sports sponsorships, and an increasingly positive perception of China. Xiaomi founder and CEO Lei Jun told investors earlier this month that the company, which had established 16,000 Mi Home stores in China, planned to establish 10,000 overseas in the next 5 years. The analysts said they believed internationalization would be the company's next key focus for growth, and they expected its international business would double in 3 years. Holger Gorg, director of the International Trade and Investment Research Group at the Kiel Institute for the World Economy, said 2 main obstacles remain for Chinese companies wishing to increase sales in Europe: the stereotype that Chinese products were of inferior quality, and fears that they might force European brands out of business. That's where sports sponsorships like Chinese EV giants BYD partnership with the European Football Championship last year and home electronics manufacturer Haya's partnership with this year's French Open tennis tournament could help. Giulia Radice, an Italian tennis fan who lives in Paris, said she had followed the French Open closely and had noticed Haya's courtside sponsorship. When I see Haya side by side with Rolex at Roland Garros, it makes them look good, it makes me feel like it's a brand I can trust. I don't think Roland Garros would accept sponsorship from cheap brands. Haya's revenue from Europe rose 12% in the last year to 32.1 billion yuan, or 4.47 billion US dollars, according to the group's 2024 financial results. It said in May that its sports sponsorship strategy was a design that adapts to the sports passions of each country and market, creating authentic and lasting relationships. There's a lot of negativity and barriers against Chinese brands or unfair competition. It's important for brands to show that they're normal, said Gerg. BYD, which declined to comment on its sponsorship strategy, sold more battery electric vehicles than Tesla in Europe for the first time in April. It's a much more positive thing to be associated with China than a year ago. So that's kind of brief, but I think it kind of ties in, first of all, with the soft power episode that I've just released. So if you haven't seen that, please go and watch or listen to that episode. But in general, Chinese brands trying to change their perception and thus change the perception of China in general from a place where you just get cheap stuff, especially if we look at the rise of companies like Shein and Temu. People definitely associate that with cheap fast fashion, cheap manufacturing, whereas you have this alternative side, and I think potentially this is a side that the CCP, that the Chinese government would want to lean into a bit more, which is the idea that the Chinese economy is developed, that it's strong, that it's attractive, that it makes good quality products. It's not just cheap brands, it's, exactly the same quality that you would expect in Europe, bearing in mind that a lot of European products are made in China anyway. So we've discussed before, again, how all the components of the iPhone have to pass through China at some point. In the episode that we discussed on supply chains, there is no decoupling from China. It all comes back to the idea that there is no decoupling from China. But now that China has developed a little bit of a better understanding of global consumerism, not that they didn't have it before, but they've understood that the link between global consumerism and their own perception, and potentially how that links to their soft power, they're now trying to actively change that perception. They're like, okay, well, we can sponsor these high-end sports competitions, we can support these really important campaigns, like in the European Football Championship is massive. It's huge, watched by people all around the world, billions of people. So we're not only getting eyeballs, but we're getting that positive association. As that lady said, why would Roland Garros associate with something that's considered cheap? We're changing the advertising practices to fit more in with what local consumers are used to. So again, it's just about changing that perception and how that change in perception links to China's overall perception. These brands and how well they do, how they're perceived, whether they're perceived as like good quality or high end or whatever, reflects on China as a whole, and again plays into China's soft power, which I've discussed in the last episode, and I will discuss when I talk about Chinese brands, maybe in the next episode. I think it's the next episode, potentially a few episodes time. So this is kind of semi-related. This is more like a hard power story. So contrasting that kind of more soft power, more private business to what the Chinese state is doing at the same time to increase China's prestige around the world, make it more important on the geopolitical stage, make it more of an acceptable superpower, if you will. So this is also in the SCMP. Why has China set up a new Hong Kong-based international mediation body? The International Organization for Mediation may be a sign of Beijing's hopes to reshape the global order with help from the global south. So I am going to discuss this story for people who are listening on audio and also for people who are on Buy Me a Coffee. But if you are watching on YouTube, this is actually the end of the video. So if you want to hear more about this story and how this plays more into China's hard power politics, and also there's another story that I'm going to talk about as well, which is more lighthearted, which is about city tiers, then please consider donating a coffee on Buy Me a Coffee, or you can listen to the audio version in a week's time that will have the full episode. So thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you again in the next one.